So today we're going to dig into the story of Antony Loewenstein. This is someone who was raised right at the very heart of the Jewish community, but he grew up to become one of its most prominent critics of Israel. We're going to look at how his perspective was formed and why he believes there's this huge shift happening within global Jewry right now. This right here, this was the message Loewenstein heard again and again growing up. And look, it wasn't just a suggestion, right? It was presented as a fundamental part of his identity, a really simple, powerful instruction that just left no room for any questions. And that really is the big question of this journey, isn't it? What happens when someone who was raised in that environment starts to actually ask what that support means? Starts to question whether the reality on the ground matches the narrative they were taught their whole lives. Okay, so to really get where Loewenstein is coming from, we have to start with where he came from. He grew up in what he describes as a liberal Jewish home in Melbourne, Australia, and his family's story was just deeply, deeply intertwined with the Holocaust, where most of his relatives were murdered. And that history, it really shaped everything. The story he was told was crystal clear. Israel was the ultimate safe haven, the insurance policy to make sure a catastrophe like that never happened again. And this wasn't just some political stance. It was presented as an essential part of being Jewish. It was reinforced everywhere, from Friday night Sabbath dinners to the sermons at a synagogue. And the ultimate proof of this was Israel's law of return, this incredibly powerful symbol that any Jew anywhere in the world could find sanctuary and become a citizen almost immediately. But, as Loewenstein got older, some cracks started to show up in that foundation. He began noticing things that just didn't quite line up with the values of safety and justice that he was taught were so important. This slide really captures that growing conflict inside him. On the one hand, he was told, Israel is our safe space. But on the other, he was hearing this really profound racism towards Arabs and Muslims, sometimes from his own relatives. He was told, we must protect ourselves. But then he'd hear people in his own community comparing Palestinians to Nazis, a comparison that, for obvious reasons, deeply troubled him. And he saw people defending policies in Israel, like separate legal systems, that they would find absolutely outrageous if they were happening in their own countries. And this is a really crucial point he makes, this complete separation. The fact that he'd never even met a Palestinian person until he was in his 20s allowed all these stereotypes to just grow and fester. He realized that when you only talk about a group of people instead of to them, it becomes so much easier to generalize, to see them only as a threat, not as, actual human beings. So all of this growing discomfort, it led him to this huge intellectual turning point, this need to pry apart his faith, Judaism, from a political ideology, Zionism. And honestly, this distinction would become the absolute core of his entire argument. Okay, so let's break this down from his perspective. First, Judaism. To him, this is an ancient, rich, thousands-year-old tradition. It's a culture and a faith that has survived for millennia, completely independent of any 20th century political project or nation-state. And then there's Zionism. In contrast, he defines this as a much more modern political movement from the late 1800s, and he argues that its core goal, to create and maintain a Jewish majority state in a land that was already populated, required, right from the very beginning, a belief system that dehumanized the Arab people who were already living there. And this distinction leads to what Loewenstein sees as a huge problem, a kind of substitution. He argues that for a lot of secular Jews, this unconditional support for the state of Israel, that's become their new religion. It's become the main way they express their Jewish identity. And in his view, it's effectively replaced the actual faith and culture that came before it. He takes this argument to a really provocative place. He ends up describing modern Zionism as a cult. And his reasoning is that, in his view, it functions like one. If you're not fully on board, if you dare to question its core beliefs, you're not just disagreed with, you're ostracized, you're cast out of the community. Now, it's important to remember, this isn't just his own personal story happening in a vacuum. Loewenstein sees his own evolution as just one small part of a much larger, almost seismic shift happening across the entire global Jewish community, what he actually calls a nonviolent civil war. And to back this idea up, he points to some pretty startling poll numbers. Get this. A poll from early 2024 found that a majority of American Jews, we're talking 60%, believe Israel has committed war crimes, and nearly 40% believe it's committing genocide. These numbers just completely shatter the idea of a monolithic Jewish community that's totally united behind Israel. And what you're seeing is a massive generational divide. While many older Jews remain staunch supporters, younger generations are increasingly, well, they're disillusioned and they're angry. They look at an Israeli government that's making alliances with global far-right figures they can't stand, and they feel completely alienated from the traditional Jewish organizations that claim to speak for them. Okay, so if the old structures are failing for so many people, what comes next? Where do you go from here? Loewenstein doesn't just critique the situation, he actually calls for a fundamental rethinking of what Jewish community and identity can look like in the 21st century. For him, the answer has to start with a reckoning. He believes the Jewish community has to confront the actions that have been taken by Israel, supposedly on behalf of all Jews everywhere, and to really accept some responsibility. He argues that, at the end of the day, this is the only moral path forward. So what does that path actually look like on the ground? Well, he lays out a kind of roadmap. First, he says, people have to accept that many of the old guard establishment organizations are beyond repair. The next step is to build new ones from the ground up, groups that are inclusive, progressive, and are explicitly opposed to the occupation. And finally, he calls for genuine interfaith dialogue that doesn't just dance around the most difficult conversation, the one about Palestine. And all of this really brings us to his ultimate thesis. He completely rejects the idea that Jewish security can be bought at the expense of Palestinian security. Instead, he argues their fates are completely intertwined. True, lasting safety for Jews, he insists, is absolutely impossible without justice and safety for Palestinians too. Which leads us with a really big question to think about. For any community where personal identity has become so deeply fused with a national political project, what are the real stakes of dissent? What does it cost to speak out? And what does it actually mean to try and build a new identity, one that's independent of the state?